So I see most of you are still here from yesterday. I take that as a good sign. Attrition is manageable. What I thought I would do is begin by trying to summarize last session and then move on to the next session. So the last session, because there was a lot in there, a lot to unpack, and I'll try to summarize it. It may be a bit of a long summary, but so our starting point was trying to make sense of the confusion of the present. How do we make sense of the fact that the world seems to be, sort of falling apart in one way, and in another way, amazing things happening on a daily basis? How we make sense of this confusion of the present is, and what we can, and the question is how we can hope to help resolve it, or at least contextualize it, by contributing to the discourses of society, by presenting a compelling set of new ideas that make sense of it all. Because ultimately, ideas are the driving force in history. The Baha'i revelation is a revolution in the idea of religion. It is a spiritual renaissance. It has the power to recreate, to regenerate the world, to renew the spiritual landscape, to bring the conflicting tribes and races and religions of the world into harmony. But our current narrative language, which I briefly summarized yesterday, is not seeming to attract large numbers of people. Of course, any narrative will always attract some people. There are a lot of people in the world, after all, and there will always be success stories that we can point to convince ourselves that we're on the right track. But it appears that the great majority of people are not interested in the ideas we are offering, at least in the way that we are expressing them. And I can think of three possible responses to this, or ways of dealing with this. The first is to keep doing what we're doing. Keep doubling down, hoping that we'll get different results eventually. A second possibility is to wait for something to change in the world that will change the receptivity of the world. Maybe some great upheaval, maybe some systemic breakdown in civilization will change people's minds. And while it's true that suffering can be transformative and open doors to different ways of thinking, I hope that is not our plan. The peace message that the House of Justice wrote in 1985 said something like, world peace is not only possible, it is inevitable. Whether it comes about through a collective act of will or through unimaginable suffering is the choice that lies before us. So hopefully we can achieve this through a collective act of will and not by waiting for things to get so bad that there's massive breakdown in society. So that leaves a third option, which is vary our approach. Find a different way of saying the same truths. Increase the number of frequencies that we're broadcasting on. We think and we believe that we're delivering the ideas that the world needs. And the world desperately does need the social teachings of the faith to be brought into practice. But maybe, as Shoghi Effendi said in that letter we quoted yesterday, the thinking world has already caught up with these ideas, at least in theory, if not in putting them into practice. So what are the ideas in the cause that we then embody in active living communities that will capture the attention of the world? What are the deeper teachings that Shoghi Effendi refers to that presumably are not the ones that are on our list of 12 principles? And very closely connected to that question is the question of, are there other narrative languages that we can employ? Are there other ways other entry points to a city that has many roads to it? And maybe we've given most of our efforts now are directed towards entering into that city through a particular road, and maybe there are other roads that one can enter this city by. And so by narrative language, then, what I mean is a different kind of conceptual framework, maybe a different vocabulary that conveys the same transformative and enlivening spirit? And are the deeper teachings, for some reason, less visible within the framework of one narrative language and more visible within the framework of another narrative language? So it's with those thoughts that what we'll attempt to do during these sessions is to explore a different kind of narrative, beginning with the statement in One Common Faith that we quoted yesterday, the statement commissioned by the House of Justice on the idea of religion not being just one more, and the Baha'i faith not just being one more faith community that's competing with the others, but rather recasting it in terms of religion being the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. So the idea is to look at this idea of consciousness over these 5 days. First in terms of history, the context of the past, and then in terms of the realms of the physical and the metaphysical, of the individual and the collective. So five pieces. And today we'll be looking at the realm of the physical. But before we do that, we first have to bring our attempted introduction to world history up to date, because we started touching upon a very important period, the period of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, but we didn't quite finish. The suggestion we made yesterday is that history can be viewed not as a meaningless series of events, but as the collective motion of consciousness from one stage to another. Do we have proof for this claim? It's not really a scientific claim. One can look at the world as being ordered from above, as being directed from moment to moment by forces that have a particular end in mind. One can also look at the world as essentially comprising a meaningless cycle of births and deaths of events following one another. And as we talked about yesterday, Baha'i himself said that these two different viewpoints, each of them have their own justification in his Habab to Manachi Sahib. And so it's rather, when we talk about seeing history as a collective motion of consciousness, it's rather a conscious choice that we make about how to see the world, rather than a scientific conclusion that we've come to on the basis of evidence lined up and tested. But it's not just a conscious choice, because we can say that it's true or false to the extent that it helps to explain and make sense of the current predicament of the world, and to the extent that it provides a remedy for its problems. And this is, by the way, how Baha'u'llah describes his own message. He doesn't say that he's delivering a provable set of scientific truths. What he tells us is he's providing a remedy for the illness of the world. This is how he says it in Gleanings. He says, the all-knowing physician hath his finger on the pulse of mankind. He perceiveth the disease and prescribeth in his unerring wisdom the remedy. Every age hath its own problem, and every soul its particular aspiration. The remedy the world needeth in its present-day afflictions can never be the same as that which a subsequent age may require. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age you live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. And so it's in light of this idea that what we're providing is a remedy. And if the remedy that we're providing is not exactly matched to the illness, then we slightly change the nature of the remedy, change the formula of the remedy. But ultimately, the goal of it is the same. The goal is curing the ills of humanity. In this case, the ill of humanity in this day is the ill of disunity. And so we'll be proposing a different kind of narrative language, a different kind of sacred narrative that sees history as this collective motion of consciousness proceeding from one stage to another, that this collective motion of consciousness takes the form of long periods of relative stability punctuated by rapid periods of change. We might call them civilizational phase transitions. And we mentioned yesterday a few of these civilizational change transitions that have been written about in great detail by other authors. Of course, the list that I mentioned is not exhaustive. I mentioned about 100,000 years ago the birth of abstract thought in humanity. That enabled us for the first time to coexist in larger groups because we can imagine ourselves as being part of something larger than just the group of people that we know personally. That also unlocked our ability to think about and plan for the future. All of this set the stage for civilization advancing to a higher level, of interconnectedness among the individuals that comprise it. We mentioned also briefly an agricultural revolution of around roughly, let's say, 10,000 years ago, that unlocked the control of the Earth's resources to enable humans to coexist in still larger groups and more concentrated groups. And we mentioned also what has been called the axial age, this strange and mystical period between around 800 and 200 years before Christ, where there's this dawning awareness across many different cultures, almost simultaneously, that we are in the world but not of the world, that life is a journey from a lower to a higher state, from bondage to freedom, from appearance to reality, from darkness to light. It was a near simultaneous phase transition of multiple cultures. And along with it came the emergence of the first great religious traditions, going from east to west: Confucianism and Taoism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Judaism of the high prophets from Elijah to Isaiah and Jeremiah, and Greek philosophy. It was the birth of the individual in human history, several centuries long, but seemingly coordinated by some mysterious clock, like the coming of leaves in the spring on a single tree and within the trees of a forest. And likewise, there has been another centuries-long major civilizational phase transition that we're currently passing through. One that began, we can mark the beginning of it around 500 years ago with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment that followed it. It's been called the second axial age. We might refer to this from our perspective within the Baha'i faith as the first dawnings of the adolescence of the human civilization as it passes from childhood into maturity. And the stage of adolescence then would comprise several centuries, the first dawnings of it with the scientific revolution, and perhaps the culmination of it with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, which was almost concurrent with the appearance of the Baha'i faith. This great civilizational phase transition that we're in the middle of was sparked by discoveries in astronomy. It led to a chain reaction of questioning, one after another, the presumptive authorities of the past. And it replaced, one by one, these ancient, unchallengeable authorities and textbooks and philosophies with new systems of human knowledge based upon the exercise of reason, the natural sciences, economic and political sciences, medical sciences, and so forth. This is such a big deal for us, and so important for us to understand today, and so still relevant today, because for all of human history, up until this time, knowledge and wisdom were things that were originated in the past, passed on by those who knew better. Even the ancient Greeks, writing 300-400 BC, even they saw themselves as standing in awe of the past. We think of them as the ancients, the sources of philosophy and logic and so much wisdom today. Even the ancient Greeks looked backwards in a way, and they looked at the pyramids of Egypt, which even in a few hundred BC were these ancient objects. And Egyptian civilization was already a forgotten thing, and the ancient Egyptians the ancient Greeks saw the ancient Egyptians as representing some higher peak of civilization that had naturally appeared in the past. But henceforth, after the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, we would see truth and wisdom as something that we're moving ever closer to in time, not ever farther away from. The idea of what we call, in the Baha'i faith, progressive revelation is born in the scientific sense during this period. And we would never again take authority at face value. To every claim in whatever domain, we would be asking, what is the proof of that claim? So I said that this phase transition in civilization began around 500 years ago. It seems like a long time ago, but in the time scale of human civilizations, it's very recent. It's still very recent. So recent that the principles of the Enlightenment have still not penetrated to the general consciousness of humanity. Most people and all organized religions on the planet, with the possible exception of one, are still living in a pre-Enlightenment state. They still live with the assumptions that dominated before the age of the Enlightenment. People still live in a state in which their lives are governed by superstitions of various sorts. And this is where the Baha'i faith comes in. The Baha'i faith is the spiritual heir of the Enlightenment and is its fulfillment in the realm of religion as the scientific revolution was the first domino to fall. You can think of the Baha'i faith as the last domino to fall. The hardest, the one that has persisted the longest is our religious sensibilities. And those are the ones that have resisted change the most. And the ones that the Baha'i revelation has come to subvert and transmute and transform. The Baha'i faith embodies the best of Enlightenment thought, for the first time embodied in a religious community that has the potential to embrace the entirety of humanity. The advent of the Baha'i faith is the culmination of this great and most recent historical phase transition, the transition from childhood to maturity, in the realm of humanity's spiritual life. The principles of the Enlightenment that I speak of are the primacy of individual conscience, embodied in the Baha'i principle of the independent investigation of reality. The rejection of received religious authority and the authority of the clergy, which is the entire message of the Kitab-i-Gan and so much of the revelation of Baha'u'llah. The centrality of mind in the cosmos, which is represented in the Baha'i writings in the concept of the primal will, which is an echo of an ancient idea of the logos found in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There's an ordering principle behind things. That ordering principle can be understood and described and thought of in very personal terms as the actions and interventions of a spiritual being, of God. One can also think of this ultimate ordering principle as the laws of nature themselves. The two are the same. It's two ways of describing the same thing, as Baha'u'llah makes clear in his Tablet of Wisdom, where he says that by nature is meant the primal will acting in and through the contingent world. The two previously separate threads of God's intervention in the world through his continuing acts of will, and on the other hand, the immutable mathematical and impersonal laws of nature described and discovered through the practice of science. These two threads end up merging into one thing. We see that they're actually two aspects of one reality. Abdu'l-Baha writes in, this is in Abdu'l-Baha in London, page 95. He says, all that we see around us is the work of mind. It is mind in the herb and in the mineral that acts on the human body and changes its condition. You know, we think of mind primarily as something that is solely the function of the human brain, but when Abdu'l-Baha talks about mind, and this is just one example of many dozens we could have picked, probably even better ones in some answered questions. The way Abdu'l-Baha talks about mind, it's something that is a continuously operative, almost field in creation, which exists at the mineral level, as he says here, and in ever increasing degrees of power and capacity is enabled by the material substrate of things as they grow in their complexity, that mind is enabled to be manifested in the world, and ultimately reaches its peak in the self-consciousness and turning back upon itself and realizing the reality of its own self. The ultimate culmination of mind ultimately is self-consciousness. And that brings us back full circle, literally, to the topic of consciousness. So this sort of takes us up then to the present moment. And what I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about today, further to the subject of science, of the unity of science and religion in this vision of the identity of God's will, of the primal will, and the laws of nature, the laws of physics. I wanted to offer a few thoughts about the relationship between some of the fundamental laws of nature, of physics, that in particular have been discovered over the last century, and their deep relationship to spiritual truths. I do this, I suppose, in part because my own background is in physics, and there's the story of the drunk man who had lost his keys, and he was looking for his keys at the base of a light post, and someone comes up to him and says, what are you doing? Oh, I'm looking for my keys. It's like, well, where did you drop them? Well, I dropped them over there somewhere. Well, why are you looking here at the base of the light post? Well, because I can see here, the light is better here, so this is where I'm looking for them. Similarly, I'm looking for, when Shoghi Effendi mentioned those deep principles of the faith, I'm going to look for them in the realm of physics because, that's the base of my particular light post. But I feel like there are a few keys there at the base of this light post. And I'll talk about three. You've probably heard of at least two of the three of these ideas. They're floating in the air and written of in popular literature, and it's hard not to have come across them at one point or another. And so I won't do any more than, I think, a very brief introduction to them, certainly not in any technical sense. But the three ideas are relativity, complementarity, and symmetry. And we'll start with relativity. It's the most famous one, I suppose, of the great ideas in modern physics. Famously discovered, and the work in almost uniquely of almost entirely of one great genius, Albert Einstein, who about a century ago comes to the understanding that ultimately space and time, how we measure space and time, is relative to our velocity and acceleration. How fast clocks move and the distance between one object and another is, in some very counterintuitive sense, a function of how quickly we're moving relative to those clocks and those objects. This is upended the classical ways of thinking about the universe, which saw space and time in immutable categories. You could think of space as a Cartesian grid of lines that everything could be mapped onto, that was quite immovable and changeless, and time likewise, and the progression of the seconds and the years and the eons as happening at a pace which was both completely consistent and regular within the measurement of one observer, but also, if more observers are measuring the same time, that everyone would measure the same ticks of the clock. And what the theory of relativity revealed about the universe is that space and time are actually not these separate immutable quantities, but they fold into each other in a way that is clearly and simply described mathematically with not even highest level mathematics, but which is nevertheless difficult to think about quantitatively, because our brains just aren't wired to think about space and time being relative quantities. But it wasn't just space and time which were relative quantities, it's also mass and energy. Through the famous equation E equals mc squared, one can transform between the energy of an object and the mass of that object through this equation. And mass and energy likewise are relative to one's velocity. Again, in a counterintuitive but very precisely definable way. So this theory of relativity tells us that the physical world, in the physical world, the same subject can be represented faithfully and without loss in many different ways. Depending on the perspective of the observer, you can describe the same system in a lot of different ways. This is a major philosophical breakthrough, really, when you think about it. And we're still, I think, coming to terms with it. Now, many different ways, but not an infinite number of different ways. So relativity is not relativism. So the theory of relativity says there's a certain subset of ways that one can describe the universe, but you just can't describe it in any which way and say, well, according to the theory of relativity, this one is just as correct as that one. The subset of possible ways of describing the universe are constrained by very precise mathematical relationships. So that's a very small mention of the theory of relativity, and we're going to come back to it in the spiritual domain in a moment. But the next idea is that of complementarity. And complementarity is, if anything, even stranger than the theory of relativity. The complementarity is the principle that there can be many different views of your subject that are equally valid, as in relativity. But that to observe your subject, you must choose a particular way of observing it. And you can observe it in different ways simultaneously. So complementarity is, you can think of as closely related to relativity, although mathematically they're separate ideas. But conceptually, it's a similar sort of idea, but it's almost like an intensification of the idea of relativity. It is most, I think, famously represented in one of the founding ideas of quantum mechanics, that fundamental particles can either be particles or waves depending on how you choose to observe them. And one can't even ask the question or answer the question, well, what are they really? They have to be either particles or waves. They actually are neither until they're observed in a way that either resolves them into being either particles or waves. So reality exists before it's observed in a state of potential in which there are different ways that it can potentially be observed, but until you actually set up your experiment or observe it in a particular way, it's only when you observe it in a particular way that those potentialities are resolved into one of the many possibilities. And having resolved it into that possibility, you can't simultaneously observe it in the other ways. You have to pick one. As you can imagine, this has there's a spiritual correlate to this idea, but we'll come back to it. So complementarity, so relativity primarily associated with Einstein's theory of relativity, complementarity primarily associated with quantum mechanics. The third great idea in the edifice of modern physics is that of symmetry. You might have heard less about this. It's the most abstract, I suppose, of the founding principles of modern physics, but really the most powerful. It's a pervasive feature of the observed universe, and underlies the formation of the laws of physics. One could try to sum it up by saying that in the principle of symmetry, certain patterns are repeated and persist through change. So, for example, a very concrete example is the symmetry of a butterfly, where if you swap the right and left-hand sides of a butterfly, you're changing something by swapping the left and right-hand wings of the butterfly. But the thing that you get after making that transformation is, for all intents and purposes, the same butterfly. So there are certain operations that you can make upon objects that change them in some way, rotate them, flip them, translate them, or things that are even more abstract mathematically. And in doing so, something has been changed, but something remains the same. So there is something. So there's a principle of invariance at the heart of symmetry, that there are certain features that are common to all representations of an object. So you may have guessed that the reason I'm mentioning these three pillars of the edifice of modern physics is not to try to give a physics lesson, but to suggest that what we may be approaching in looking at these principles of physics are some of the deeper spiritual truths, not just of the Baha'i revelation, but of that underlie the spiritual traditions of the human race throughout the great traditions. What do I mean by this? Well, let's start with the principle of relativity. The principle of relativity is maybe the easiest one to map from the physical domain into the spiritual domain. We have clearly the principle of relativity in the Baha'i faith, and we all know it is the principle of the relativity of religious truth. That truth is in some way relative to one's perspective. The principle of the relativity of religious truth is operative in the Baha'i faith, both in space and in time, just as it is in Einstein's theory of relativity. It's operative in time in the sense that from one dispensation to the next, there is something in the law of religion that is the same, and there's something that changes. It's what we call the idea of progressive revelation.
What?
Progressive revelation.
The word before progressive changes.
Something remains the same, but something changes. The religion is evolving. The outer form of it is changing, but the core spiritual truths are unchanging. Baha'u'llah identifies this actually as a tablet of Baha'u'llah, where he says everything in the religions of the world changes over time. Everything changes. All the laws and ordinances change, except for one thing, except for one law. And he said, it is the law of love, which he says, like a fountain ever flows and is ever replenished. That's the one constant. But everything else is relative to time. It's also relative to space. So in a strangely, similar way to Einstein's theory of relativity, you can think of relativities in time and space. You can also think of the relativity of religious truth in time and in space. So in time, it's progressive revelation. But what's the relativity of religious truth in space? By space, we're talking about at a particular moment in time, there are certain billions of individuals on the planet, each with their own ideas about ultimate reality, each with their own spiritual path that they're treading. And Baha'u'llah, in many of his mystical works, particularly those that were published very recently in the Call of the Divine Beloved, including the 7 Valleys and the 4 Valleys and a number of other mystical works, describes the process of spiritual journey, both the journey of one individual through different stages of recognition and expansion of consciousness, but also different kinds of spiritual paths he describes. For example, the 4 Valleys is a particularly good example of this, where he's not just describing progression in time, but he says there's 4 different kinds of seekers. And And these are the four kinds, and this is how they look at the world in different ways. And each of them is correct within their own station, within their own path. So there's relativity of religious truth in space as well in this sense. Baha'u'llah quotes a hadith of Islam also in this respect, that the good deeds of the righteous are the sins of the near ones. So even our ideas of good and evil, our ideas of what is true and false, are relative to our perspective. But just as with Einstein's theory of relativity, to say that the truth of the religious truth is relative is not to descend into relativism. It's not to say that, well, now any perspective is equally true. In the same sense that only a subset of physical descriptions of a system are true according to the principle of relativity. In the same way, only a subset of possible spiritual positions are true. And so the principle of the relativity of spiritual truth does not lead to the conclusion that all opinions are the same. So let's look then briefly at complementarity. So complementarity is again the idea that, for instance, an elementary particle can either look like a wave or a particle, but you have to pick one or the other. At a higher level, at a spiritual level, one can think of this principle of complementarity existing in the reconciliation of opposites such as matter and spirit. Material and spiritual in the Baha'i writings are described sometimes as separate things and sometimes described as the same thing, depending on your perspective. And you really can't, you can either look at it from one perspective or the other perspective, but you can't kind of fit them in your head at the same moment. In Baha'u'llah's Tablet of the Universe, he says, earthly and heavenly, material and spiritual, substance and form, the inner and outer realities of all things, all of these are woven together and interrelated in such a way that drops are patterned after seas and atoms are patterned after suns. And then he says, universal in particular are in reality incidental and relative considerations. So there's a tablet of Abdu'l-Baha where he takes all of these pairs of opposites, which are kind of like particles and waves, conceptually. It says these are all sort of aspects of each other. They're equivalent to each other, but ultimately we can only approach these realities through one pole at a time. This, I think, principle of complementarity is also manifested in what people sometimes read as contradictions within the Baha'i writings. And people would write to Shoghi Effendi about these contradictions that they would see and say, well, Baha'u'llah says this here, but then over here he says the opposite thing. What's going on? And there's several letters by Shoghi Effendi where he says that basically you have to see from a broader perspective to understand that these contradictions are part of a larger picture. In one of his letters, he says that the Baha'i teachings are like a sphere. There are opposite poles, and in between are the thoughts and doctrines that unite them. And just like a sphere, you can only ever see half of the sphere at one time. You have to pick which hemisphere of that sphere you're looking at. And when you look at that, that hemisphere, that particular pole is in focus. And while that pole of the sphere is in focus, you can't even see the opposite pole. It's not visible to you. And if you were to try to spread it out onto a map, yes?
I was going to say, would an example complementarity be the dual nature of the manifestations?
That could be another example, the dual nature of the manifestations, that they're at one and the same time embody this irreconcilable humanity and divinity. And they are, but you can't really see them at the same moment as one or the other. You have to, and they only speak in the language of one or the other at any particular moment. So that's a great example of that. But with this map analogy too, if you try to take a sphere and expand it onto a sheet of paper, then you can't capture both poles. If you capture the North Pole, then the South Pole ends up going off to infinity. There's no way to capture all the entire surface of a sphere on a sheet of paper without tearing it or vastly distorting it, infinitely distorting it. Spiritual truth is, I think, a similar kind of a thing. And there are complementary spiritual truths where if one is well focused in the two-dimensional surface of our limited minds, then other realities end up becoming completely incoherent. And the third one, just to finish off, and I know this is a lot to sort of dump on you in one session, but so we will finish soon. The third is symmetry. And this is, as I mentioned, perhaps the most abstract one. At bottom, the principle of symmetry tells us that the universe is not described by things, but by relationships. Ultimately, it's not things which are the foundation of the universe, but relationships. And these are relationships of symmetry.
What was the first word you used? Things.
Not things, but
Things.
yeah, not things. Like, every elementary particle in the end, when you zoom in on it, there's nothing there. Protons and electrons, the building blocks of matter, the more we zoom in on them with our most powerful microscopes and means of trying to get at them, we find that there's nothing there. It resolves into dimensionless points. Protons resolve into quarks, but then the quarks resolve into, as far as we can tell, dimensionless points. Matter is an illusion. The solidity of matter is an illusion. But what gives matter its solidity to us are the dense network of relationships between these fundamental entities, which are sometimes particles and sometimes waves. So it's relationships ultimately that are the building blocks of the universe and not things. And these relationships or symmetry principles, which underlie the laws of physics, also can be thought of as underlying some of the great spiritual principles of the faith. The principle of symmetry would say that if you swap one thing for another, the left wing and the right wing of the butterfly, you end up with the same butterfly. In a more abstract sense, the principle of symmetry is operative in the idea of the oneness of mankind, in the oneness of the prophets, in the oneness of religion. There's a symmetry principle between one prophet and the next, just like there's a symmetry principle between one star and another star. Two luminous bodies. Switch one with the other in the sky, and the sky looks the same. Of course, stars are not exactly identical, but it's that same idea. And likewise, prophets are not exactly identical, but there's a light that they emanate, which is the same light, from age to age. And there's a symmetry principle in the sense of swap one with the other, and after that symmetry transformation, there's something has changed, but something else even more fundamental has remained the same. There's a symmetry principle between the macrocosm and the microcosm, the universe of the very large and the universe of the very small. Baha'u'llah mentions this and quotes one of the most ancient philosophical texts which have come down to us, the Emerald Tablet, that as above, so below. That which is above is like that which is below, and vice versa. There's a principle of correspondence between and repeated patterns all across the chain of being in the universe, and one finds that these patterns can be interchanged with each other, and something remains through that process. So these are three ideas that are central to the scientific enterprise and are in some ways the deepest ideas that underlie the equations and laws of physics that we presently understand. These three ideas also appear to be deeply embedded spiritual principles within the teachings of the Baha'i faith as well. There's a wonderful book called A Beautiful Question by a Nobel laureate physicist, Frank Wilczek, and he spends his whole book talking about these ideas of symmetry and complementarity and relativity. And at some point in the midpoint of his book, he writes, these big ideas, relativity, symmetry, invariance, which is the flip side of symmetry, complementarity, form the heart of modern physics. They should be, though they are not yet, central to modern philosophy and religion. I felt that was a powerful insight, and as yet has not yet been followed up, by other thinkers in writing, at least that I've seen. Now there's a larger perspective to why this matters today, why this is helpful for us today, because these principles, it's not just that, oh, isn't it neat? There are interesting correlations between the physical world and the spiritual world. It's not just an interesting fact to observe, but it actually gives us keys to resolving practical problems in the world. And the practical problem in the world that they resolve is the problem, the central problem of that Baha'u'llah's dispensation is aiming to resolve in the world, and that's a problem of disunity. The problem particularly of religious disunity. The problem of different groups of people having irreconcilably different theologies. Monotheistic theologies competing with trinary theologies, and the Trinity competing with polytheistic theologies that still exist on the Indian subcontinent, competing with non-theistic theologies in the Far East, represented in Buddhism and Taoism, competing with the atheistic views of the world that we find in the modern secular West. Is there a way to reconcile these? Is there a way to show that and make the argument that there's something behind all of these perspectives, and according to the principle of the relativity of religious truth, that we can somehow find a way to embrace them all within their own perspective and within their own station? That's the promise that Baha'u'llah gives us in the Seven Valleys and in so many of his writings. And I believe that this way of looking at the universe that modern physics has given us, which invites us to see the universe not through a single lens, but to realize that there are different ways, different equally valid and compatible ways of describing and defining one thing. And these differences are intrinsic to the human reality. Our purpose in the world, in the future of humanity, does not lie in the direction of everyone ultimately believing the same thing in the same way. But the future of humanity will be characterized by continuing diversity of thoughts and opinions. This is a point that Baha'u'llah makes in one of the additional newly translated tablets in Call of the Divine Beloved. And I wish I had put that up here, so I'm going to have to paraphrase it from memory. But basically Baha'u'llah says, and this is in the third tablet in the volume, he says that basically that there is a diversity of views owing to the fact that everyone is in a different spiritual state and in a different spiritual pathway. And Baha'u'llah says this is a feature of the world that can in no wise be altered. It's the way things are. And then Baha'u'llah says what to do about that. And what to do about that is not find the common thing that everyone, the common doctrine or dogma that everyone signs on to. Baha'u'llah says the thing to do is be patient and forbearing and forgiving towards each other. The solution is not dogmatic finality, but the solution is embracing diversity at the deepest level. Even when that diversity entails embracing and loving someone whose belief system to you seems wrong. The good deeds of the righteous are the sins of the near ones. And Baha'u'llah takes it to that level. He says we have to be forgiving and forbearing towards each other. And ultimately, I think this confluence of our understanding of the physical universe and the fact that the physical universe cannot even theoretically be described in a single set of terms, but there are a multiplicity of ways of describing the physical universe. That idea, I think, deeply resonates with this principle of the relativity of religious truth. That is, I think, the key to unlocking the problem of religious diversity and providing a sound theological platform for the eventual embrace of all nations and all peoples within a united world that's able to move forward in unity even through and in spite of the diversity of individual opinions. So let's stop there for today. And if there are a few minutes left, maybe we can pause for reactions or thoughts or questions. Yeah.
So when we consider, that wide latitude of different thoughts and opinions and approaches, and then if we consider a religion that's cast across the globe and then has specific laws we need to follow, is there, how do those mesh together?
Yes. So how do you come up? So the bigger question is, how do you intersect? In the theoretical level, it's easy to say, we're accepting and embracing of all these different perspectives. But now you get to the world, and when you're in the world, and you have to decide, well, there's going to be a system, there's going to be laws that have to be followed. Well, what are those laws going to be? And who gets to decide what those laws are? Is it the Baha'i conception that at some point we will impose Baha'u'llah's laws upon everyone on the planet? Is that our idea of how it's going to go? Probably not. Will there be a framework of law that, like any framework of law, is a result of consensus of what the best way forward is, as imperfect as anything in the planet is, and then people choose to follow certain laws out of their own personal sense of what's right and what's wrong. And when I say this, what I have in mind is the model of humanity's emergence into maturity. So if prior to this we were in the state of childhood and we're now passing through adolescence to maturity, what happens in the state of childhood? You're given a bunch of rules by your parents. You have to follow those rules. As you approach and pass through adolescence, you find you're given certain freedoms, and the youthful, the sort of typical youthful, route is sometimes to abuse those freedoms, because one is experimenting and one is trying everything, and one ultimately, however, transcends one's youthful adolescence, and one moves past the excesses of one's youth into maturity. What happens in the phase of maturity is not that you resolve the problem of the excesses of your youth by reimposing the rules of your childhood, but rather, as an adult, you are mature enough to make your own decisions. You have exactly the same freedom that you had as an adolescent, but now you're choosing what to do rather than be dictated what to do. Perhaps it's the same kind of thing that humanity is moving into, and how we can think about the laws of the faith in the future. That these aren't the laws that are dictated to the child without their consent, but they're the laws of right behavior, the laws of what conduces to human flourishing that mature adults will choose on their own to follow. That's just one way of thinking about it. There's a bunch of, Pete.
Yeah, I was just thinking, it seems to me that the collective decision-making found in consultation allows for exactly the flexibility you're talking about here. Because at one point, an assembly might decide to make a decision in a particular way based upon their understanding of circumstances at that time. That decision, later on, years, perhaps even decades on, would be considered to be, pretty coarse or something which, because it times have changed, circumstances have changed, the participants have changed, and their understanding of the scriptures have changed.
Yes. Yeah, great point. All right, I know there's other questions, and so even though the bell is rung, I mean, come up to me personally or come afterwards and we can continue the conversation. But those who need to escape from the heat, now is a good chance to do so. So thanks for sitting through this.